Welcome to Ancestors. I'm your host, Scott Wilkinson. Today we'll explore religious records, which are records kept by churches pertaining to important events in our ancestors' lives, including baptisms, marriages, and burials. Religious records have generally been kept longer than most other genealogical records.
Church records are one of the more important record groups that we use as genealogists, because in researching, for example, 18th or 20th century ancestors, you have vital records. You can go to whatever government organization or government bureaucracy was keeping birth records on your ancestors, marriage records, and death records. But civil records are fairly recent. In this country, for example, in the state of Pennsylvania, they started keeping them in 1906. So what do you do when you want to find vital records for an ancestor who was born, say, 1830? You're not going to write to some state government agency and ask for a birth certificate. That time period, you've got to start using church records. They become your vital records for ancestors living during that time period.
Greg Spaker from Rochester, New York, had always been told his ancestors were of German descent. That's why he was surprised at what he found in some local religious records.
When I started my research into my family, I did go back over and talk to my aunts and uncles. I asked specific questions to them, and they couldn't really give me factual answers. Well, I think that Grandpa was born about this date, or I've heard that grandmother's father came from the Black Forest in Germany, and that's only hearsay. I like to deal in facts. I knew the religion of my family, at least back as far as my family could tell me than that. And so the next logical thing would have been to look at church records.
In order to search religious records for your ancestors, of course you need to know their religion. And while many families did keep the same religion for generations, it was actually very common, especially as people emigrated, for them to change religion based on something as simple as which church was closest to where they lived. Many immigrants took on a new religion as they took on a new life.
Finding the church affiliation of an 18th century ancestor is not necessarily easy, because there was a proliferation of beliefs back east during the colonial period. There were more denominations practicing a variety of some form of Christianity in 18th century colonial America than in any place in Christendom. And so if, for example, you have an ancestor who's living in southeastern Pennsylvania, 1776, how do you go about finding what denomination he belonged to? Your best means of finding his church affiliation is to find out where he lived, as close as you can identify within the township, and then start looking for the nearest churches, and ignore state boundaries, and ignore county boundaries, and ignore township lines. Because if your ancestor had a farm that was on the township line, and it was in, say, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, but the closest church was in the next county, your ancestor isn't going to stop at that township or county line to say, okay, I'm going to go to the church in my county. He's going to go to the nearest church.
Religious records could include registers from churches, synagogues, or mosques. However, today we're going to focus on Christian church records. Sometimes knowing where your ancestors came from or where they settled is the key to determining their religious affiliation.
When we're dealing with immigrants and we know the country that our immigrants come from, we can make some generalizations because of the state church in that country of what the religion probably was. For instance, if they're from Scotland, the chances are fairly good that they're going to be Church of Scotland, or what we know today as the Presbyterian Church. Or if they're from England, it could be the Church of England, which we know in America as the Episcopal Church, or they're the Anglican Church. If they're from Scandinavia, it would be the Lutheran Church, because that was the state church and the record-keeping entity in Scandinavia.
If you have an ancestor who came to this country during the late 19th century from a country like Poland or Italy or the Austro-Hungarian Empire and was Catholic, the odds of having to change or having to research for a change in church affiliation are not that great, particularly if you're Catholic. But if your ancestors came to this country in the 17th, 18th, or early 19th century, then you've got a real problem, because there was probably some change in church affiliation.
If you're still having trouble determining the religion of your ancestors, often other records can help, like obituaries or marriage certificates, or even a family tradition. And once you've determined the religion, you're ready to access the records.
If you're looking for information on an ancestor who may have lived in the area in the 19th century, then the records could still be at the church. Then you're going to have to contact the church, either through the minister or perhaps the church secretary, and make a determination. Do they have the records? Do the records still exist? And if they do, then can I get access?
You really need to know the specific circumstance of that church or of that area. So what I will normally do is I will call a local public library and ask the reference person, who is a local historian or genealogist that I could talk to? Who is a person that would know about the history? And then they're usually very helpful. They will give me the name of the local genealogist or historian, and then I could talk to them. And they will say to me, the local clerk at the Congregational Church will tell me, well, we have some records, but the vast majority of the records over the years is deposited in this repository or church archive in another state. Also, you will find that the church records are being held, the old church records are being held by the local genealogical society or being held in a local public library because they were part of a manuscript collection. The Family History Library has cataloged all of its fiche, books, and microfilm. And they have broken this down by locality, by title, author, and by different ways to accessing the records. Now this could be accessed on the internet, could be accessed at a local family history center in your town, on fiche or on computer. So there's various different ways to access the Family History Library catalog. You really have to think about what is the best way to approach the record, whether to go after it by a locality or by a subject. Now, if we're talking about church records as an example, looking at the subject of Methodist Church or Quakers, sometimes you can get into some records that you would not normally see cataloged under a specific town. And you might get into some really fun collections that you would never normally thought about if you go to the subject catalog to search for the church as well as to the locality catalog. It's a real hit and miss situation because there are so many different churches and so many different records. A lot of them are not going to be available on microfilm, but it's always worth checking.
If your ancestor was Christian, you'll probably begin by looking for one of three records: baptism, marriage, or burial. Greg decided to look for the baptismal record of his grandfather.
I knew about the Mormon Family History Center and visited there to find different sources that I might be able to use in order to locate the baptismal records for my grandfather. And a family history specialist was able to point me in the direction of the Family History Library catalog and search for records that might lead me in the direction of my grandfather's birth. Being Catholic, we searched for church records, and I was able to find the two German churches that were in operation in the area of the city that he lived in when he was born. And from that, I was able to get a film number, and I found out at that point that the film that I was looking for was on indefinite loan at this particular Family History Center. And so I didn't even have to wait to be able to start searching for my grandfather's birth.
The baptismal record is important for a number of reasons. First of all, for the denomination that practices infant baptism, where you get the date of birth or date of baptism, you now have a record that marks the beginning of that ancestor's life.
In the baptism register, obviously the child's names are recorded, including the surname, and plus the parents, the mother and the father's names, the date of birth and the date of the baptism.
And so that is the link. That is the statement of fact that says, okay, Tom Jones, born 1757, is the son of David Jones and Margaret.
One of the rewards of finding an ancestor's baptismal record is the unexpected information you just might come across. And that's exactly what happened to Greg.
And as I went through the roll of microfilm, it wasn't very long before I started to see my surname listed with other people. And all of a sudden, there in front of me was the name of my grandfather and his birth date, his baptismal date, his parents' names, and sponsors for my grandfather's baptism. And those sponsors turned out to be siblings of my great-grandparents, and now the family tree has just expanded that much farther. When I found my great-grandparents' name was dancing around the microfilm reader, because it was exciting to me, as here's another piece of who I am that I did not know before I came to the Family History Center. I was amazed to find the detail in the records in the area that I was searching in, the years that I was searching in. It listed countries where these people came from. And it wasn't just countries, it was regions in the countries. So I found that my great-grandfather, in his record, his father, my great-great-grandfather, came from an area that was listed in the record as Lothringen. I said, Lothringen, is that a region? Is it a country? What is it? It's not in the United States. Another researcher turned to me and said, well, Lothringen is Lorraine, and that's not in Germany, it's in France. It's a German word for Lorraine. So here I've got relatives who I thought had come from Germany, my ancestors, and they had come from the eastern part of France and immigrated from there possibly, and not from Germany. It was a total surprise to me.
Another major church record is marriage. In fact, churches have been keeping marriage records much longer than civil authorities, especially in Europe, where church records may predate civil records by hundreds of years.
Marriage records, of course, are a legal document in this country, and in those, obviously, the maiden name of the girl who's being married, the name of the man, their father's names are kept, their age at the time of the wedding, and who took the service, and of course the date of the date of the marriage itself, of course, is kept.
As we move into the American context, you're no longer getting the information like you would find, for example, like a baptismal record or like a marriage record in Europe. And so what we essentially find, for example, in marriage records in 18th and early 19th century America is limited, information is limited to basically the name of the husband, the wife, and the date of marriage. Fortunately, most of the time you do get her maiden name, which gives you something to start, but only on occasion do you find the names of parents.
Greg Spaker was able to order French religious records on microfilm, and as he went through them, he was amazed at what he found.
The very first record that I find, and I searched a period of 30 years from before my ancestors immigrated to the United States, was a marriage record in January of 1818 for a man by the name of Joseph Spaker and a woman by the name of Barbie Schweitzer. As I continued searching through the records, I was able to start doing children to them. And lo and behold, here is my great-great-grandfather. So I had found the marriage record of my third great-grandparents, my great-great-great-grandparents. I never expected to be able to get back this far. To be able to find this information and be able to trace myself back where I came from was just such an unbelievable feeling.
While baptism and marriage records can contain valuable information, you'll want to take a look at burial records as well. These records will often have additional clues and hidden information.
Yes, in the burial register, obviously it's the name of the deceased, the date of the burial, and I usually put in the date of the death as well.
I think a lot of genealogists probably don't go looking for them because they're more interested in the baptismal records and in the marriage records, because the marriage record and the baptismal record establish relationships. Baptism, of course, to the previous generation, the parents, the marriage to the wife and her family. The burial death record does not establish a relationship. It brings a life to an end. But it's equally as important because when you can find it, you no longer have to wonder, well, what happened to this man? Where did he end up?
There's so many variables, and the variables are not only with the religion and the requirements of the religion, but also the priest and what he felt was important on the record. Some priests, in a Catholic record as an example, might decide that it was important to recognize that the baptism occurred and that person truly had the sacrament of baptism before they had the marriage. And so they will actually include on the marriage record the place of baptism, which is very helpful genealogically. Other times, they will actually go back to the baptismal record and write the marriage or the death on the record. And so to tie everything together.
When it comes to religious records online, there's a variety of things you're going to find. You're going to find archives for religious institutions, like Catholic archives, Methodist archives, that sort of thing. You'll find websites that will describe those archives, tell you how to access them. You're going to find catalogs, such as the Family History Library catalog, that will point you to various religious records that you can then go offline to find.
We've discussed the more obvious records, baptism, marriage, and burial. But there are lesser-known church records as well, such things as communicant lists or confirmation records.
When people are researching church records, they tend to always think of just the three main records: baptisms or christenings, marriages, and then deaths or burials. And what they tend to forget is that there's a lot of other records that might be compiled by that church or by the local minister. For instance, there are certain churches that are very big on keeping detailed minutes, and you can pick up in the minutes when people enter that congregation where they came from, or if they moved to another place where they went. So minutes are very important. For certain churches like the Baptist Church, where they didn't do infant baptisms, the only places where they'll actually mention the people are in minutes. You have other churches where they might keep detailed lists of the members, communicants, or confirmation records, where you can go through the list of the members and really see when that person moved there and when they left, because they'll say right on the membership list, went to this place, and so that really helps with genealogy. The key is not be totally focused and have blinders on that all the records are just going to be baptisms, marriages, and deaths, that there could be other records that the church keeps that really can help your research project.
I was contacted by another genealogist from Virginia by the name of Sharon Crandall. And Sharon's original last name was Spaker, but spelled differently with a K. As it turns out, Sharon and I are fourth cousins.
I had some time, decided I'd do some research, and called the Genealogy Society in Rochester, New York. I told the gentleman that answered the phone that I was working on the Spaker line, that my maiden name was Spaker, and could he give me any leads? And he said, yes, by all means. He said, you have to contact Gregory Spaker. He also is working on that family line. As it turns out, I had all the information that Greg didn't have, and Greg had all the information I didn't have. So as we sat and we talked, it was like putting this gigantic puzzle together, piece by piece by piece.
She had gone back to France, had been to the village of Farebersviller, had met a cousin who was also the president of their local genealogical society.
Now all of a sudden, you're there, you're at this place, you're standing at the foot of this grave, and this person's blood is just running right through your veins as well. It's such an awesome feeling, an overwhelming feeling.
Almost everyone, as they learn more about their ancestors, has a desire to visit where their people are from, to walk where they walk. And that's exactly what Greg Spaker did.
So I decided at that time that if I was going to go, it needed to be now. To realize that the roads and the streets you are walking on in these villages in Europe are the same ones that your ancestors may have walked on 300 years ago. And to meet these people who you've never met before, and to see in their eyes and in their face the same thing that they are seeing when they look back at you. The features in your face have carried down through generations, and the look in your eyes have carried down through generations. And to experience that and to realize that they are as excited to see you, somebody who has come back to their village as you are to be there was just an incredible experience. One of the surprises that I had in my visit to France was the mayor of the town where my family had originally settled had a reception for me. There was probably 100 different speakers from that village and the surrounding villages where they had moved. And on the wall was a huge chart listing all the descendants of Christian that they knew about.
This is my father, yeah, which is here.
And then the mayor brought out something that was very special to me. She brought out a book which had the original birth record for my 5th great-grandfather and the death record for my 6th great-grandfather. And to see that original record and to hold that original record, it was something that brought tears to my eyes to be able to hold this record and realize that somebody had taken the time to record my ancestors' passage in history.
I mean, it was the church record that brought the average man out of his obscurity in the 16th century. Before the advent of church records in the 16th century, basically we can find information on people who were prominent in the community. But it was the church record that started recording information on the average guy living down the street in the little village in England or in Germany or in France. And therefore, it is with the church record that people become known.
Religious records not only establish the key events in your ancestors' lives, they also provide insight into the beliefs that influence their lives. And that's what it's all about, discovering your family and connecting with your ancestors.
5 years ago, I started with one baptismal record, one church record for my grandfather. And I found that, and then I found great-grandparents, and then I found great-great, and so forth. And it went back. 5 years later, I know of 3,000 descendants from my 6th great-grandfather. It's broadened my life and my appreciation for who I am and where I came from and why I do the things I do. That we are a sum of everybody who ever came before us. That we have characteristics that were also your 5th great-grandfathers. And when you look at somebody's photograph from 100 years ago, you can see yourself in their eyes. It is hard to describe, but you have that sense of knowing who you are. And I think many of us are looking for that today.
Next time on Ancestors, cemetery records.
I had never done any research in a cemetery. I mean, I just thought, well, gee, you walk around and if you get lucky, you know. It just didn't seem possible that I would really find his grave because he still seemed such a mystery and such an unknown.
Funding for the Ancestor series is made possible by a grant from the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation, proud to support the worldwide effort to bring families together, and by AncestralQuest.com. Every family has a great story just waiting to be discovered. AncestralQuest.com, helping families find their stories and their ancestors for over 50 years.
Learn more about finding your family history by visiting the Ancestors website, where you can download pedigree charts, access online databases, and explore the ins and outs of genealogical records.
The Ancestors Research Kit, Tools for Discovering Your Family History, is now available. The kit guides users through the family history research process and includes instructional videotapes, the Ancestors Guidebook, and key genealogical forms. To order, call 1-800-758-0846. A series companion book, In Search of Our Ancestors, is also available.